My husband sat across from me in the lawyer's office and said without hesitation, "After the divorce, the house is mine." He said it like it was already decided, like I had never mattered, like everything I built had always belonged to him. His lawyer nodded, flipping through papers, until I slowly reached into my bag and placed one document on the table. The room didn't explode. It went silent. And that silence changed everything. If this moment already has you feeling something, go ahead and like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, what would you do if someone tried to erase your place in your own home? And where are you watching from right now? My name is Sarah Diaz, and for nearly 20 years I believed I had built something unshakable. We lived in a quiet, sunlit neighborhood just outside San Diego, one of those places where every lawn was trimmed just right, where neighbors waved politely but rarely asked too many questions. From the outside, our life looked complete. A stable marriage, a beautiful home, weekend dinners on the patio, the kind of life people assume must have taken years of teamwork and love to create, and in a way it did, but not in the way people thought. Daniel Carter. My husband was the kind of man who could walk into a room and instantly own it. He had that easy confidence, the kind that made people lean in when he spoke. He knew how to tell a story, how to shake hands just firmly enough, how to make even strangers feel like they were part of something important. People liked him. They trusted him. They admired him. And for a long time, so did I. When we first met, Daniel was ambitious-driven and full of plans. He talked about building a life, not just living one. He wanted a home, a family, something solid that would last. I remember sitting across from him in a small coffee shop during one of our early dates, listening to him describe the future like it was already written. Back then, I believed I would be part of that future, and I was, just not in the way I imagined. In those early years, we worked like a team, or at least I thought we did. We both had jobs, nothing glamorous at first, but enough to get by. We saved, we planned, we talked about one day like it was a promise we were both committed to keeping. But even then, there were small things I didn't fully understand. Daniel always wanted to be seen as the provider, not just financially, but symbolically. He needed to feel like the one who was building everything. At first, I thought it was just pride, something harmless, something I could support. So when I got a raise before he did, I downplayed it. When I picked up extra work, I framed it as helping us both. When we started saving seriously for a house, I never corrected him when he told people I'm working hard to make this happen. I told myself it didn't matter who got the credit. What mattered was that we were moving forward together, and for a while that story held. Until it didn't. Things began to shift slowly, so slowly that I didn't even realize it was happening at first. Daniel's career plateaued. Not dramatically, not in a way that would raise alarms, but enough that the momentum he once had stalled. Promotions stopped coming, opportunities slipped past him, and each time something didn't work out, I could see it chip away at him. At the same time, my career started to grow. I moved into a more stable role in healthcare administration, managing projects, overseeing budgets, making decisions that actually mattered. The pay was better. The hours were longer, but predictable. I became reliable. For both of us. At first, Daniel said he was proud of me. He told people how hard I worked, how dedicated I was. But something underneath that pride felt strained, like he was saying the right words but not fully meaning them. I remember one night sitting at the kitchen table going over bills. I had just transferred money into our joint account to cover a larger expense, and Daniel glanced at the screen. "You're getting really comfortable handling all this," he said. It didn't sound like a compliment. "I mean, it's our money," I replied carefully. He gave a small shrug. "Yeah, just don't forget who started all this." That was the first time something inside me tightened. I didn't argue. I didn't push back. I told myself he was just frustrated, that it would pass. But it didn't. Over the years, those small comments became more frequent, more pointed, less subtle. Daniel still presented himself as the backbone of our life to the outside world. At gatherings, he would talk about his house, his plans, his future, and I would stand beside him, smiling, nodding when letting the narrative continue, because correcting him in public felt like betrayal, because I thought protecting his pride was part of loving him, because I believed, maybe naively, that what we had was still real, even if the story we told others wasn't entirely accurate. But inside the walls of that house, things felt different. Conversations became shorter, silences became longer, and the space between us, once filled with shared plans, started to feel like something else entirely. Distance, resentment, something unspoken but growing. Daniel began spending more time out of the house. Networking events, work dinners, weekends that suddenly had commitments I wasn't invited to. When I asked, he brushed it off. "It's just work, Sarah. Not everything needs to involve both of us." And maybe he was right, but it didn't feel like work. It felt like he was building a life that didn't include me. At the same time, he became more critical of the life we already had. The house wasn't good enough anymore. The neighborhood was too quiet. The furniture we had chosen together suddenly felt outdated to him. It was like everything we had built was no longer something he wanted to stand behind. Except for one thing, the house itself, that he still claimed, relentlessly. He would run his hand along the kitchen counter or stand in the doorway looking out at the backyard and say things like, "This place, this is what I worked for." And every time he said it, something inside me went quiet, because I knew the truth, but I had stayed silent for so long that correcting him now felt impossible. So I didn't. I let him keep talking. I let him believe his own version of the story. I let the world believe it too. What I didn't realize, what I couldn't have known at the time, was that by letting that lie grow unchecked, I was giving him the confidence to one day try to take everything from me. And when that day came, he didn't hesitate. He didn't question it. He didn't even consider that I might fight back, because in his mind the story had already been written. The house was his, and I was just someone who had been living in it. If you had asked anyone in our circle how we got our house, they would have told you the same story. Daniel worked hard. Daniel saved. Daniel made it happen. I heard that version so many times that it almost started to sound real even to me. But the truth, the actual truth, was quieter, less impressive on the surface, and far more complicated than Daniel ever let anyone see. We bought the house 12 years into our marriage. At the time, it felt like the biggest milestone we had ever reached. We'd spent years in smaller apartments, moving from one lease to another, always telling ourselves that one day we'd have something permanent, something that belonged to us. Daniel talked about it constantly, a place with a yard, a real kitchen, a home we can grow into. And I wanted that too. Maybe not for the same reasons, but just as deeply. What no one knew, what Daniel made sure no one ever questioned, was how that house actually became possible. Because it wasn't just his effort, it wasn't even mostly his. The down payment, the thing that made the entire purchase possible, came from me. Not from a salary bonus, not from some lucky break, from years of quiet preparation, and from something even more personal. After my mother passed away, she left me a modest inheritance. It wasn't life-changing money, not the kind that turns your world upside down overnight, but it was enough to matter, enough to be used carefully, intentionally. I didn't spend it right away. I didn't even tell many people about it. I let it sit. I let it grow. I treated it like something that needed to be protected, not displayed. Because my mother had always been like that, careful, thoughtful, quiet about what she had, but very clear about what it meant. Security isn't loud, she used to say. It's something you build when no one is watching. When we started seriously looking at houses, Daniel was excited, almost restless. He talked about mortgages, locations, square footage. He compared properties like he was already living in them. But when it came time to actually make an offer, reality hit us. We didn't have enough. Not for the kind of home he wanted, not for the kind of life he had been describing to everyone. I remember sitting at the dining table late one night, papers spread out, numbers not adding up. Daniel leaned back in his chair, frustrated. "We're close," he said. "We just need a little more." I didn't answer right away, because I already knew what a little more meant. It meant the inheritance. It meant the savings I had built quietly over years. It meant stepping in not just as a partner, but as the one who would make the final piece fall into place. I can cover the difference, I said finally. Daniel looked at me surprised. What do you mean I have savings? I explained carefully. And some money from my mom. I didn't go into details. I didn't list numbers. I didn't make it sound like something significant. I just offered. For a moment, Daniel was quiet. Then his expression shifted. Relief. Followed by something else I didn't recognize right away. Something sharper. Well, he said, sitting up straighter, that makes things a lot easier. That was it. No questions about where exactly the money came from. No hesitation about using it. No conversation about how we would structure things moving forward. Just acceptance. And in that moment, I made a decision I didn't fully understand the weight of yet. I didn't push. I didn't say we should make sure this is documented properly. I didn't say, this changes the balance of ownership. I didn't say anything that might have disrupted the version of the story Daniel preferred, because I thought we were a team, because I believed that what was mine was ours, because I trusted that the intention behind it mattered more than the recognition. So I transferred the money. We made the offer, and just like that, we had a house. The day we got the keys, Daniel was glowing. He invited friends over that same week, walked them through every room like a tour guide. This is the result of years of hard work, he said, gesturing around proudly. I told you I'd make it happen. People congratulated him. They shook his hand. They admired him. And I stood beside him, smiling, saying nothing. At first, it didn't bother me. Not really. I told myself it didn't matter who got the credit. What mattered was that we had built something real. But over time, the story started to change. Or maybe it didn't change. Maybe it just got louder. Daniel began referring to the house differently. Not our house, not even the house, but my house. It slipped into conversations casually at first. I've been working on my house. Come over to my place this weekend. Everything here, I built it. Each time I felt it. A small, quiet discomfort. But I pushed it down. Correcting him felt unnecessary, petty even. I didn't want to turn something good into a point of conflict. So I let it go, again and again, until it wasn't small anymore. Until it became the truth he believed. And once he believed it, he started using it. The first time it happened during an argument, I almost didn't register it. We were in the kitchen, ironically the part of the house I had been most excited about when we bought it. The conversation had already been tense. Something about schedules, responsibilities, things not being shared evenly. And then Daniel said it. If you don't like how things are, Sarah, you know where the door is. I froze. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. This is my house, he added almost casually. I'm not going to be uncomfortable in it. The words landed heavier than any shout could have. For a moment, I couldn't even respond, because part of me was still trying to understand what he had just said. Not the sentence itself, but what it meant, what it revealed. I looked around the kitchen. At the cabinets I had chosen, the countertops I had insisted on, the space I had imagined us growing old in, and for the first time, it didn't feel like mine at all. I thought this was our house, I said quietly. Daniel shrugged. It is. But let's be honest about who made it happen. There it was. Not anger, not frustration, but certainty. A belief so deeply rooted that he didn't even question it. And that was the moment something inside me shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. Enough for me to realize that the story I had been protecting was no longer protecting me. It was protecting him. And the longer I stayed silent, the stronger that story would become. I still didn't fight him that night. I didn't correct him. I didn't bring up the money or the inheritance or the truth. I just stood there absorbing it, letting it settle, letting it become something I could no longer ignore. Because deep down, I knew this wasn't the last time he would say those words. And the next time, it wouldn't just be an argument. It would be something much bigger, something final, something that would force me to decide whether I was willing to keep living inside a story that erased me, or finally tell the truth. Looking back now, I can see exactly when the shift became irreversible. At the time, it didn't feel like a single moment. It felt like a slow, unraveling thread by thread, conversation by conversation. silence by silence, until one day there was nothing left holding us together except habit and appearance. Daniel didn't change overnight. That would have been easier to understand. Instead, he evolved into someone I no longer recognized, while still wearing the same face, the same voice, the same practiced charm he showed the world. The difference was in what he stopped hiding. He became obsessed with how our life looked from the outside. Not how it felt, not how it functioned, just how it appeared. It started subtly. He upgraded his wardrobe. Not just a few new pieces, but a complete shift in style. Tailored jackets, expensive watches, shoes that cost more than anything he used to buy without thinking twice. At first, I thought maybe it was a confidence boost, a way to feel in control again after his career had stalled. But then came the comments. "You know, Sarah, people notice these things. Presentation matters. Perception is everything." He didn't say it directly, but the implication was always there. I didn't fit into the version of life he was trying to project anymore. I was too practical, too grounded, too real. While he was trying to reinvent himself into something sharper, more impressive, more desirable. And slowly he began treating me like I was holding him back. Dinner conversations became critiques. The way I dressed, the way I spoke, the way I handled things at home, even the way I relaxed. "You're always tired. You don't put in the effort anymore. You used to care more." Each sentence was small on its own, but together they built something heavy, something suffocating. I found myself second-guessing things I had never questioned before. Was I too quiet? Too focused on work? Not supportive enough? I started adjusting, trying, bending, but nothing seemed to be enough. Because the truth was, it wasn't about me improving. It was about him distancing. And once I realized that, everything started to make a different kind of sense. He spent more time out of the house, not just for work, but for things he never fully explained. Networking events, client dinners, weekend meetups. Sometimes he would come home late smelling faintly of expensive cologne that wasn't his, or carrying the kind of energy that didn't belong to a long day at work. I didn't accuse him, not because I didn't suspect anything, but because I knew that if I asked directly, he would deny it. And I wasn't ready to hear another version of the truth twisted into something I couldn't prove. So instead, I watched. I listened. I paid attention to what he said and what he avoided saying. And what I saw wasn't just distance. It was detachment, like he had already stepped out of the life we shared but hadn't told me yet. At home, things became colder, not explosive, not loud, just empty. We moved around each other like strangers sharing the same space. Meals were quieter, evenings were separate, and the house, the place that once felt like a shared dream, started to feel like neutral territory, a space neither of us fully occupied anymore, except when it came to control. That was the one thing Daniel never let go of, especially when it came to the house. He started making decisions without asking me. Changing things, rearranging furniture, talking about renovations I had never agreed to. "This place needs an upgrade," he said one afternoon, standing in the living room like he was evaluating a property. I looked at him confused. "It's our home," I said, "not a project." He didn't even look at me. "It's my investment," he replied. "I'm thinking long term." That word again, my. Each time he said it, it felt more deliberate. Less accidental, like he was reinforcing something, practicing it, preparing for something bigger. And then, it happened. The night everything became undeniable. We were in the kitchen again. It seemed like all our worst conversations happened there. Maybe because it was supposed to be the heart of the house, the place where things were shared. And instead, it had become the place where things broke. I don't even remember what started the argument. Something small, something that didn't matter, but like always it escalated. Not in volume, but in weight. "You don't appreciate anything I've done." Daniel set his voice tight. I stared at him. "Daniel, that's not true." "It is," he cut in. "You act like this life just happened." I felt something in my chest tighten. "This life didn't just happen," I said. "We built it together." He laughed, a short, sharp sound that didn't carry any humor. Together, he repeated. "That's what you think," the way he said it. It wasn't a question. It was dismissal. And then he said the sentence that changed everything. "Let's be clear about something, Sarah." His voice dropped, calm, controlled, almost rehearsed. If this ends, and it will, you're not walking away with this house. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. You can take your clothes, he continued, your personal things, whatever you came in with. He finally looked at me, directly, cold, but the house stays with me. For a moment, the room felt like it tilted, like everything I had believed, even in the smallest way, was suddenly unstable. You're serious, I said quietly. Of course I am. There was no hesitation, no doubt, just certainty. Like he had already seen the outcome, like he had already decided how the story ended. You think I'd let you take this from me, he added. Take this from me. The words echoed in my mind as if I were the one trying to steal something, as if I hadn't been there from the beginning, as if I hadn't contributed, as if I hadn't sacrificed, as if I hadn't stayed. I looked around the kitchen again, but this time I didn't see memories. I saw something else, a pattern, a narrative that had been building for years. One where Daniel was the creator, the owner, the one who made everything possible, and I was just part of the background, replaceable, temporary, removable. You really believe that, I said. I don't believe it, he replied. I know it. And that was the moment everything inside me went still. Not broken, not defeated, just still. Because for the first time, I understood something clearly. This wasn't anger. This wasn't ego. This wasn't even about winning an argument. This was a plan he had been building quietly, the same way I had once built security quietly. The difference was, his plan depended on me staying silent, on me not pushing back, on me continuing to let him own the story. And for years, I had done exactly that. I didn't argue with him that night. I didn't bring up the money. I didn't defend myself. I didn't even raise my voice. I just nodded slightly and said okay, because in that moment, I realized something he hadn't. He thought he was preparing for the end of our marriage, but I had already prepared for something else entirely, something he had forgotten, something he never even knew existed. And when the time came, when he stood there so sure of himself, so certain of the outcome, that's when everything he believed would finally start to fall apart. After that night in the kitchen, something inside me shifted in a way I couldn't undo. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't pack a bag or slam a door or call a friend in tears. If anything, I became quieter, more observant, more careful. Because once Daniel said those words, once he made it clear that he wasn't just imagining a future without me, but actively planning one, I understood that I was no longer living inside a marriage. I was living inside a strategy, and if I wanted to survive what was coming next, I needed to understand it. So I started paying attention, not just to what Daniel said, but to what he did, to patterns, to absences, to the small, almost invisible shifts that most people would overlook. At first, it was little things. He started taking calls in another room, closing doors, lowering his voice. If I walked in unexpectedly, he would pause just for a second before continuing like he was recalibrating. It's work, he would say casually. But it didn't feel like work. It felt rehearsed. Then there were the documents. One evening, I went looking for a file we had always kept in the same place. Insurance records, tax statements, the usual things couples share without thinking. It was gone. Not misplaced, not messy, gone. When I asked him about it, he didn't hesitate. I reorganized everything he said. It's more efficient now. Where is it, I asked. I'll send you what you need, he replied. Not we, not ours, I'll send you. That was the moment I realized something fundamental had changed. Access. He wasn't just emotionally distancing himself. He was separating information, control. He was creating boundaries inside a space that used to be shared. And I wasn't on the inside of those boundaries anymore. A few days later, I noticed a notification on his phone while it sat on the kitchen counter. I wasn't trying to look. I wasn't searching, but it was there. A name I didn't recognize, followed by a message that read, "Everything's still on track." That was it. No context, no explanation. But something about it made my stomach tighten, because it didn't sound personal. It sounded coordinated, like a plan in motion. I didn't confront him. Not yet, because I knew something now that I hadn't fully accepted before. If Daniel was building something behind my back, then confronting him without proof wouldn't stop it. It would just make him hide it better. So instead, I stayed quiet. And I started preparing in my own way. Not aggressively, not emotionally, but intentionally. I made copies of what documents I could still access. Bank statements, tax returns, old records. Anything that still connected me to the truth of what we had built. And every time I did, I noticed something else. Small inconsistencies. Transactions I didn't recognize. Amounts that didn't match what I remembered. Nothing obvious enough to accuse, but enough to raise questions. Enough to confirm that something wasn't right. At the same time, Daniel's behavior outside the house became more distant. He stopped asking about my day, stopped including me in conversations about the future, stopped pretending we were moving forward together. Instead, everything he talked about felt separate. His plans, his goals, his next steps, like I'd already been removed from the picture, even before anything was official. Friends started noticing too, not directly, but in subtle ways. "Is everything okay with you two?" one of my coworkers asked after I mentioned Daniel had been out of town again. "Yeah," I said automatically. "Just busy, busy." That word became my shield, my explanation, my excuse. Because the truth felt too heavy to say out loud. And I wasn't ready to make it real yet. But the turning point, the moment everything inside me went from suspicion to clarity, came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. I had taken a half day off work, something I rarely did. The house was empty, still, quiet in a way that felt almost unfamiliar. I stood in the living room for a moment looking around, at the couch, the windows, the walls that had held years of conversations, laughter, tension, silence. And then I walked toward the hallway closet, not because I needed anything from it, but because I knew something was there. Something I hadn't touched in years, the safe deposit key. It was small, simple. Attached to a keychain I almost never used anymore. For a long time, I just held it in my hand, turning it over, feeling the weight of it, because opening that box meant opening something else too, something I had chosen to bury, not forget, just not revisit. Because revisiting it meant acknowledging that a part of my marriage had never fully healed, that a warning I had once received might have been more real than I wanted to admit. I stood there longer than I expected, caught between two versions of myself. The one who still hoped things could somehow stabilize, and the one who already knew they wouldn't. In the end, it wasn't anger that pushed me forward. It wasn't even fear. It was clarity, a quiet, undeniable understanding that whatever Daniel was planning, I could no longer afford to be unprepared. So I grabbed my bag, took the key, and drove to the bank. The entire drive felt surreal, like I was moving through something that had already been decided long before I got there. The parking lot was half empty. The sky was clear. Everything looked normal, which made what I was about to do feel even more significant. Inside, the bank was quiet, routine, people going about their day without realizing that mine was about to change. I signed the forms, showed my ID, followed the clerk into the back, and when they placed the box in front of me, my hands didn't shake. Not this time. Because whatever was inside, I already knew it mattered. I just didn't know how much. Not yet. I opened it slowly, carefully, like something fragile might break if I moved too quickly. Inside were a few documents, neatly organized, untouched for years. And there it was, the paper I hadn't looked at in so long, but had never truly forgotten. I stared at it for a moment, not reading, not analyzing, just recognizing. Because this wasn't just a document, it was a decision, a version of myself from years ago who had seen something I didn't want to fully accept at the time, and had chosen to protect me anyway. Back when I still believed that kind of protection might never be necessary. Back when I thought love would be enough. I picked it up. I held it in my hands, and for the first time since everything with Daniel started to unravel, I didn't feel uncertain. I didn't feel afraid. I didn't feel like I was reacting anymore. I felt ready. Because whatever he thought he had planned, whatever version of the story he believed in, he had built it on one assumption, that I had nothing, that I had no leverage, that I had no way to stop him. And as I sat there in that quiet room at the bank holding the one thing he had never accounted for, I realized something simple. He wasn't just underestimating me. He had completely forgotten who I was. The last time I'd seen that document before that afternoon at the bank, I had folded it with shaking hands. Not because I didn't understand what it meant, but because I understood it too well. It had been nearly 8 years earlier, back when our marriage was still intact on the surface, but quietly cracking underneath. Back when Daniel's charm still worked on me more often than it didn't. And back when I hadn't yet learned the difference between forgiveness and forgetting. It started with something that felt small at first. At least that's how I convinced myself to see it. A financial decision Daniel made without telling me. An investment. That's what he called it. An opportunity. A smart move. Something that would pay off later, except it didn't. And the problem wasn't just that it failed. The problem was that he had used money that wasn't entirely his to risk. Money that was meant for something else. Money that had come from a place he didn't fully respect. My inheritance. I didn't find out immediately. Of course I didn't. Daniel didn't present it like a mistake. He presented it like a temporary situation, something that just needed time to balance out. But over time, the numbers didn't add up. Transfers that didn't make sense. Gaps in accounts, excuses that felt rehearsed, until one night I stopped accepting explanations and started asking direct questions. Did you use that money? I asked him standing in the living room, the weight of the realization already settling in my chest. Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked at me like he was deciding which version of the truth would be easiest to manage. It wasn't like that, he said finally. That sentence. That exact sentence. It always came before something I wasn't going to like. How was it then, I asked. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing slightly. It was an opportunity, Sarah. I didn't want to miss it. You used my money, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. It's our money, he corrected. No, I said quietly. That wasn't. For the first time, he looked defensive. Not apologetic, not remorseful. Just irritated that I was pushing back. I was going to replace it, he said. You're acting like I stole from you. The word hung in the air. Stole. Neither of us said it again, but it didn't need to be repeated, because the damage wasn't just financial. It was something deeper, something harder to name. Trust. That was the first time I realized that Daniel and I weren't standing on the same foundation anymore, that what I saw as shared responsibility, he saw as access, that what I treated as careful, intentional security, he treated as something available to use and justify later. We argued that night. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a weight that didn't disappear when the conversation ended, because there was no real resolution, just a kind of uneasy silence, a fragile agreement to move forward, and for a while, we did. Or at least it looked like we did. Daniel became more attentive, more careful, more aware of how his actions affected me. He reassured me, promised transparency, promised that nothing like that would happen again, and I wanted to believe him. So I did. Not completely, not blindly, but enough to keep going, enough to stay. But something had changed inside me, not in a way that showed on the surface. I still smiled, still supported him, still moved through our life the way I always had, but underneath that, there was a new awareness. A quiet voice that reminded me you need to protect yourself, not because you don't love him, but because love doesn't guarantee safety. That was when Laura Bennett entered the picture. Laura wasn't just any attorney. She had known my family for years. She had handled my mother's estate. She understood where that inheritance came from and what it meant. I didn't go to her because I wanted to take action against Daniel. I went to her because I needed clarity, because I didn't fully trust myself to separate emotion from reality anymore. We met in her office on a quiet afternoon. I remember sitting across from her trying to explain everything without making it sound worse than it was. He didn't mean to hurt me, I said at one point. Laura didn't respond right away. She just watched me, carefully, patiently. Sarah, she said, finally intent and impact are not the same thing. I swallowed. I don't want to overreact, and I'm not telling you to, she replied calmly. I'm telling you to be prepared. Prepared, that word stayed with me. What does that mean, I asked. It means, Laura said, leaning slightly forward, you don't wait until something happens again to protect yourself. You do it now, quietly, without making it a war. I felt my chest tighten. You think he would do something like this again? Laura didn't answer the question directly. Instead, she asked one of her own. Do you trust that he wouldn't? The silence that followed was answer enough. That was when she explained my options, not dramatic ones, not confrontational, but strategic, legal structures, documentation, agreements that could define ownership clearly without needing to be announced, without needing to disrupt the marriage if things stabilized, but strong enough to matter if they didn't. It's not about punishing him, Laura said. It's about making sure you're not left unprotected if trust is broken again. I remember hesitating, because even though everything she said made sense, it felt like I was admitting something, admitting that a part of me no longer believed things would always be okay. Will he have to know? I asked. Laura shook her head slightly. Not unless you choose to tell him. That made it easier. Not morally, but emotionally. Because I wasn't ready to turn my marriage into something openly adversarial. I just wanted security. So I agreed. Over the next few weeks, Laura prepared everything, carefully, precisely. Every detail tied to the origin of the house funds, the structure of ownership, the conditions under which certain rights would apply. It wasn't complicated for the sake of being complicated. It was intentional, designed to hold weight if it ever needed to. The day I signed it, I felt something strange. Not relief, not fear, something in between. Like I had just drawn a line I hoped I would never have to point to. Keep this safe, Laura told me, handing me the finalized document. I will, I said, and I meant it. But I also meant something else. I meant I hope I never need this. For years after that, I didn't. Daniel kept his promises, at least on the surface. He didn't touch money that wasn't shared. He didn't make decisions without telling me. We moved forward, built more, stabilized, and slowly the memory of that moment faded. Not completely, but enough that it stopped feeling immediate, urgent, necessary. So I placed the document in the safe deposit box, locked it away, and chose to believe that the worst was behind us, that the line I had drawn would never need to be used, that the version of Daniel who had crossed it was gone. But sitting there in that bank room years later holding that same document in my hands, I understood something I hadn't fully grasped back then. I hadn't created that protection because I stopped loving him. I had created it because deep down, I had already seen what he was capable of. And even though I chose to move forward, a part of me had never forgotten. And now, neither would he. The divorce didn't begin with shouting. It didn't begin with slammed doors or dramatic ultimatums. It began the way everything between Daniel and me had begun to shift in recent years, quietly, methodically, and with a kind of calm that felt more unsettling than anger ever could. He filed first. Of course he did. I found out on a Wednesday morning just as I was getting ready to leave for work. There was a knock at the door, firm official, unfamiliar. When I opened it, a man in a neutral expression handed me an envelope and asked me to confirm my name, Sarah Diaz. I nodded. You've been served. Just like that. No conversation, no warning, no attempt to sit down and talk like two people who had shared nearly 2 decades of life. Just paperwork. I stood there for a moment after the door closed, the envelope heavy in my hands, my heart beating slower than I expected. Not faster, slower. Like something inside me had already anticipated this, had already adjusted to the idea before it became real. I didn't open it right away. I set it on the kitchen counter, the same counter where we had argued, planned, eaten, and slowly drifted apart, and just looked at it. This is it, I thought. This is where the story changes. But when I finally opened it, I realized something else. The story hadn't just changed. It had already been rewritten. The language in the filing was cold, clinical, detached in a way that made everything we had shared feel distant, almost irrelevant. Irreconcilable differences, division of assets, primary residence. That phrase stood out immediately. Primary residence, not our home, not shared property, just something to be assigned, determined, taken. And as I read further, Daniel's intention became unmistakably clear. He wasn't negotiating. He wasn't uncertain. He was claiming. The house our house was listed in a way that suggested he believed he had the stronger legal position, that he had already established a narrative that would support his ownership, that whatever conversations had happened before this had already moved beyond me. I folded the papers carefully, not out of respect for them, but because I needed to keep my hands steady. because this wasn't the moment to react. This was the moment to observe. That afternoon, I called an attorney, Emily Harper. She came recommended through a colleague, someone who described her as sharp but not aggressive unless she needs to be. That was exactly what I needed. Someone who wouldn't escalate things unnecessarily, but also wouldn't let me be pushed aside. When I walked into Emily's office for the first time, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not fear, not panic, but clarity. Like I had finally stepped into a space where things would be named directly, where I wouldn't have to guess what was happening, where the truth, whatever it was, would be laid out plainly. Emily greeted me with a calm professionalism that immediately put me at ease. "Tell me what's going on," she said after we sat down. So I did. I told her about the marriage, the house, the shift in Daniel's behavior, the way he spoke about ownership, the divorce filing, everything. Except one thing, the document. I didn't mention it. Not yet. Not because I didn't trust her, but because I needed to understand something first. I needed to see how far Daniel was willing to take his version of the story, without interruption, without correction, without knowing what I had. Emily listened carefully, took notes, asked precise questions. Who contributed to the down payment, she asked at one point. "I did," I said, "mostly." "Do you have records of that?" "I believe so." She nodded. "And how is the title currently structured?" I hesitated. "Joint," I said, which was true, but not complete. Emily leaned back slightly. "Okay," she said. "Based on what you've told me, this could go in a few different directions. But I'll be honest, if he's coming in this confident, he probably believes he has a strong position." I almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because it confirmed something I already knew. He believed. That word again. "He does," I said quietly. Emily looked at me. "Then we need to be prepared for that," she replied. Prepared, the same word Laura had used years ago, but this time it carried a different weight, because this wasn't about a possibility anymore. This was happening. Over the next few days, things moved quickly. Emails, documents, requests for financial disclosures, and through it all, Daniel remained composed, distant, almost unaffected. We didn't speak directly much. When we did, it was brief, transactional, like two people who had already accepted that whatever they once shared was over. But what stood out most wasn't what he said to me. It was what I heard from others, mutual friends, acquaintances. People who had spoken to him recently. He seems really sure about everything one of them mentioned casually. Said the house situation is already handled. Handled. That word stayed with me. Not because it surprised me, but because of how easily he said it. How confidently, as if the outcome wasn't just likely but guaranteed. And the more I heard it, the more I understood something important. Daniel wasn't just preparing for divorce. He was performing certainty. Projecting control, building a narrative not just for the court, but for everyone around him, because if everyone believed the same story, it would feel real, even if it wasn't. A week later, we had our first formal meeting, a preliminary discussion, nothing final, but important, because it would set the tone for everything that followed. When I walked into the conference room, Daniel was already there, dressed sharply, relaxed. Leaning slightly back in his chair like this was just another meeting, he was prepared to win. Beside him sat Richard Coleman, calm, focused, professional, exactly as I remembered from that first moment. Emily sat next to me, composed, attentive, ready. The air in the room felt still, not tense, not yet, just waiting for something to begin. Daniel glanced at me briefly, not warmly, not coldly, just briefly, like acknowledging a detail. Then he looked back at the table. Richard opened a folder, cleared his throat slightly, and began outlining Daniel's position. Clear, structured, confident. As he spoke, I listened carefully, not just to the words, but to the assumptions underneath them. Because that's where the truth always hides. And as the conversation moved forward, as the house came up, as the language of ownership started to take shape, I felt something settle inside me. Not fear, not doubt, but certainty. The kind that doesn't need to be spoken, because it already knows what's coming next. I still hadn't revealed the document. Not to Daniel, not to Richard, not even to Emily, because this wasn't the moment. Not yet. This was the moment to let him speak, to let him commit, to let him build his case on a foundation he believed was solid, because the stronger he believed it, the harder it would fall. And as I sat there listening to him describe a version of reality that excluded everything I had contributed, everything I had protected, everything I had silently carried for years, I realized something simple. He wasn't just underestimating me, he was relying on it, and that was exactly why I was going to win. The first real settlement meeting was scheduled for the following week, not in a courtroom, not under a judge's authority, just a quiet conference room, neutral territory meant to encourage cooperation, as Emily had put it. But there was nothing cooperative about the way Daniel walked in. He looked comfortable, too comfortable, like a man who had already seen the ending and was just going through the motions to get there. He greeted no one beyond a brief nod, took his seat across from me, and adjusted his cufflinks as if this were just another business negotiation he was fully in control of. Richard Coleman sat beside him, organized, composed, flipping through a stack of documents with practiced ease. Emily sat next to me, calm and attentive, her pen already in hand, and I sat there, quiet, still, watching. Because this wasn't the moment to interrupt. This was the moment to let him show me exactly how far he was willing to go. Richard began. "Let's start with the primary residence," he said, his tone measured and professional. There it was again. Primary residence. Stripped of meaning, reduced to a category. He continued outlining Daniel's position with clarity. According to their argument, Daniel had been the primary financial driver during the early acquisition phase. The property had been maintained through joint marital effort, but with a disproportionate contribution from Daniel over time. Based on this, they proposed that Daniel would retain full ownership of the home. Proposed. The word was almost polite, but the tone behind it wasn't. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a declaration disguised as negotiation. Emily didn't respond immediately. She let the statement sit. Then she glanced at me briefly. Not asking, not pushing, just checking. I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Not yet. She turned back to Richard. "Can you clarify the basis for the initial down payment?" she asked. Richard didn't hesitate. "Our understanding is that it was a joint contribution," he replied smoothly. "My understanding, joint." The words slid across the table like they had always belonged there, like they had never been questioned. Emily tilted her head slightly. "And the source of funds," she pressed. "Combined savings," Richard said. Still smooth, still confident, still wrong. I could feel Daniel's attention shift slightly, not toward me, but toward the conversation, like he was monitoring it, making sure it stayed aligned with what he expected. I didn't speak. Not yet. Because this was exactly what I needed, to hear them say it, clearly, confidently, on record. Emily made a note, then leaned back slightly. "All right," she said. "And what is your proposed settlement for Miss Diaz?" Richard glanced at Daniel briefly before answering. Daniel gave the smallest nod, subtle but unmistakable. Permission control. Then Richard spoke. "We're prepared to offer a financial settlement equivalent to a modest portion of the home's current equity," he said. Modest? I almost laughed, not out loud, but inside, because the word felt so carefully chosen, so intentionally soft, as if it could hide what it actually meant. Additionally, Richard continued, "Mr. Carter is willing to allow Miss Diaz a reasonable transition period before vacating the property. Allow. There it was. The word that said everything. He was allowing me to leave my own home on his terms, in his timeline, like I was a guest who had overstayed." The room stayed quiet for a moment. Emily didn't react immediately. Neither did I, because reactions, especially emotional ones, were exactly what Daniel expected, what he was prepared for, what he knew how to manage. Instead, I watched him. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his posture relaxed, confident, certain, like this was the part where I would finally break, argue, get upset, say something that would make me look unstable, emotional, weak, but I didn't. I just looked at him, calmly. And for a brief second, something flickered across his face. Not doubt, not yet, but something close to it, like he couldn't quite read me, like I wasn't reacting the way he expected. Emily spoke then. "We'll need to review the full financial disclosures before responding to that proposal," she said evenly. "Of course," Richard replied. Professional, polished. But I noticed something. A slight pause, just a fraction of a second. When Emily mentioned disclosures, like something in the timeline didn't sit perfectly. It was subtle. Most people wouldn't have caught it. But I did. Because I wasn't just listening to the words. I was watching the gaps between them, the small places where certainty hesitates. Emily continued asking questions, dates, transactions, ownership structure, and with each answer, Richard gave the picture Daniel had built started to feel too clean, too simple, like it had been constructed to sound right, not necessarily to be right. At one point, Emily asked about a specific timeline when certain funds had been transferred during the home purchase. Richard answered, but this time he glanced down at his notes first, then spoke. And when he did, there was something slightly different in his tone, still confident but less automatic, like he was double-checking himself. Or more accurately, like he was realizing something needed to be double-checked. I felt it then, that shift. Small, but real. Not enough to change the room, not yet, but enough to matter. Daniel didn't notice. He was still leaning back, still composed, still watching everything like it was unfolding exactly as expected, because from his perspective, it was. He didn't see the hesitation. He didn't hear the slight change in rhythm. He didn't recognize that the foundation he was standing on had just developed its first crack. And that was when I understood something clearly. This wasn't about one big moment, not yet. This was about pressure, precision, timing, letting the truth surface in a way that couldn't be dismissed. Because if I revealed everything too early, he would fight it, deny it, twist it. But if I let him commit to his version first, if I let him build his case fully, then when the truth came out, there would be nowhere for him to go. No version of the story left to hide behind. The meeting continued for another hour, back and forth, questions, answers, positions stated, nothing resolved, not officially, but something had changed, even if only slightly, even if only beneath the surface, because as we stood to leave, as chairs shifted and papers were gathered, I saw it. Richard glanced at Daniel, just briefly, but long enough to suggest something unspoken, a question, a concern, something that hadn't been there at the start. Daniel didn't notice, or if he did, he ignored it, because in his mind, everything was still under control, still on track, still his. As we walked out of the building, Emily turned to me. "You've been very quiet," she said. I know I replied. She studied me for a moment. "Is there something you're holding back?" I met her eyes. For the first time since this all began. I considered saying it, showing her, ending the uncertainty. But then I thought about Daniel, about the way he had spoken, the way he had built his case, the way he had looked at me like I was already gone, and I shook my head slightly. "Not yet," I said. Emily didn't push, she just nodded. "All right," she said, "but when you're ready, we use everything we have, everything we have." I almost smiled, because she didn't know, not yet, how much everything really was. As I walked to my car, I reached into my bag for a moment, just to feel it, the document, still there, still quiet, still waiting. And for the first time since this all started, I felt completely certain of one thing. Daniel thought he was winning, but he hadn't even seen the real game yet. The second meeting wasn't supposed to be different. That's what Daniel believed. That's what Richard probably believed too. From the outside, it was just a continuation, another round of discussion, another step toward what they assumed would be a predictable outcome. But for me, this was the moment everything changed. I could feel it before I even walked into the room, not as nerves, not as fear, but as something steadier, final, because this time I wasn't just listening, I wasn't just observing, I was ready. Emily sat beside me again, her posture calm but focused, a stack of documents neatly arranged in front of her. She gave me a brief glance as I took my seat, something searching in her expression. She knew. Not exactly what, but enough to understand that something was coming. Across from us, Daniel looked exactly the same as before. Confident, composed, certain. He didn't even try to hide it anymore. And why would he? From his perspective, nothing had changed. Richard opened the meeting, reviewing where things had left off. Property division, financial disclosures, the house, always the house. When he got to that point, his tone remained steady, but I noticed something subtle. He wasn't as fluid as before. There were slight pauses now, small hesitations between sentences, like he was moving carefully. More carefully than he had the first time. Daniel didn't notice, or if he did, he didn't care, because in his mind all of this was still just procedure, formalities before the inevitable. Richard finished outlining their position again, almost identical to before. The same assumptions, the same structure, the same quiet certainty that the house would remain with Daniel. Emily waited, then turned slightly toward me. It was a small movement, but it carried weight, because this was it. The moment she had been waiting for, the moment I had delayed, and now, the moment I couldn't postpone any longer. I reached into my bag, slowly, deliberately, not to create drama, not to draw attention, but because this needed to be done carefully, correctly. I felt the paper before I saw it, the same paper I had held in the bank, the same one I had signed years ago, the same one that had sat quietly while everything around it changed. I placed it on the table, gently, between us. Not directly in front of Daniel, but closer to Richard, because this wasn't for Daniel, not yet. This I said calmly should be reviewed before we go any further. The room didn't react immediately. There was no sudden shift, no dramatic pause, just stillness. Richard looked at the document, then at me, then back at the document. "May I?" he asked. Yes, I said. He reached for it, opened it, and began to read. At first, nothing changed. His expression remained neutral, professional, focused. But then, something shifted. It was subtle, almost invisible, a slight tightening around his eyes, a pause where there shouldn't have been one. He adjusted the paper, read a section again, slower this time, more carefully. Daniel noticed that. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone lightly impatient. Richard didn't answer. Not immediately. He kept reading, page by page, line by line, and with each second that passed, the silence in the room grew heavier, not tense, not explosive, but weighted, like something significant was unfolding quietly, without needing to be announced. I watched Daniel, because this was the first moment he didn't fully understand what was happening. At first he looked mildly annoyed, then curious, then uncertain. "Richard," he pressed. Richard finally looked up, not at me, at Daniel, and for the first time since I'd known him, there was no confidence in his expression, only something else. Concern. "We need to talk about this," Richard said carefully. Daniel frowned. About what? Richard glanced back down at the document, then back at Daniel. "This changes things." 3 words. That was all it took. I saw it then. The exact moment Daniel's certainty cracked. Not shattered, not yet, but fractured. "What do you mean, changes things?" Daniel asked, his voice sharper now. Richard leaned back slightly, still holding the document. This agreement he began choosing, his words carefully establishes that the original funding of the property was derived from protected separate assets. Daniel blinked, confused. "That doesn't matter," he said quickly. "It was years ago. Everything after that was joint." Richard didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned the document slightly toward Daniel. "Read this section," he said. Daniel took it, more abruptly than necessary. His eyes scanned the page. At first, his expression didn't change. Then, it did, just slightly. A flicker, a pause, like he had hit something he didn't expect. This doesn't mean what you think it means," he said, his voice tightening. But he didn't sound convinced. Richard leaned forward. "Daniel," he said more directly. "Now this document outlines conditions under which the property retains its classification, tied to the original source of funds." Daniel shook his head. No, that's not. "It also includes provisions regarding misuse or misrepresentation tied to those funds," Richard continued. That was the moment everything shifted, not just in the room, but inside Daniel, because now he understood. Not fully, not every detail, but enough to realize that something he had completely overlooked was now standing directly in front of him. "You didn't tell me about this," Richard said. His tone wasn't accusatory, but it wasn't neutral either. It was firm. Daniel looked at him. "I didn't know about it," he snapped. Richard held his gaze. For a second too long. "Are you sure about that?" he asked. Silence. Heavy, unavoidable, because that question wasn't just about the document. It was about everything. What Daniel knew, what he didn't, what he chose to ignore, and what he had built his entire case on. Daniel looked back down at the paper, flipped a page, then another, faster now, like he was searching for something, a loophole, a misinterpretation, anything that would restore the version of reality he had been so certain of. But it wasn't there, because the document didn't argue, it didn't exaggerate, it didn't rely on emotion. It simply stated, clearly, precisely, legally. And that was something Daniel couldn't fight the way he fought everything else. With confidence, with narrative, with control. "This doesn't change ownership," he said finally, but his voice had lost something. That edge, that certainty. "It significantly affects how ownership is evaluated," Richard replied. The difference between those two sentences was everything. Daniel leaned back in his chair, but this time it wasn't relaxed. It wasn't confident, it was unsteady. Like the position he had been sitting in so comfortably before, no longer fit. Emily spoke then, for the first time since the document had been placed on the table. "I think we'll need to reassess the property division in light of this information," she said calmly. No triumph, no aggression, just clarity. Professional, measured, final. The room was quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet as before. This wasn't anticipation. This wasn't waiting, this was realization. Because for the first time since this process began, Daniel didn't control the narrative anymore. And as I sat there watching him try to piece together what had just happened, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't even feel vindicated. I felt something simpler, something stronger, truth, the kind that doesn't need to be raised, the kind that doesn't need to fight, the kind that just stands. And in that moment, everything Daniel believed about the house, about me, about how this would end, collapsed, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. For a moment after the document landed, it felt like the air had been pulled out of the room. Not all at once, but slowly. Like something invisible had shifted and everyone was adjusting to it in real time. Daniel was the last one to catch up. "You're overcomplicating this," he said, his voice tight, forcing confidence back into place. "It's just a document. It doesn't override everything else." But even as he said it, he didn't sound like he believed it. Richard didn't respond immediately. He closed the file slowly, then rested both hands on the table looking directly at Daniel. "This is not just a document," he said, calm but firm. "This is a legally binding agreement tied to the origin of the funds used to acquire the property." Daniel leaned forward. "And it's been years. Everything since then has been shared. That's not how this works," Richard replied. There was no hesitation now, no softness, just clarity. And something else. Distance. The kind that appears when a professional realizes their client hasn't told them everything, or worse, has built an entire case on something that isn't true. "You should have disclosed this earlier," Richard continued. Daniel's head snapped toward him. "I didn't know about it," he said sharply. Richard held his gaze. Long enough to make the silence uncomfortable. "Then that raises another issue," he said. Not accusatory, but unmistakably serious. Daniel leaned back in his chair, exhaling hard, his composure starting to crack. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "You're acting like this changes everything." "It does," Richard said. No pause, no hesitation, just a statement. And that was the moment I saw it. The exact second Daniel realized he was no longer in control of the room, because until now, Richard had been aligned with him, speaking for him, supporting his position, reinforcing his confidence. But now, Richard was speaking to him, questioning him, correcting him, and that shift, subtle as it was, changed everything. "What exactly are you saying?" Daniel asked, his tone sharper, now defensive. Richard took a breath. "I'm saying that the foundation of your claim to the house is weaker than we believed," he replied. "We believed, not you believed. We." That word mattered because it meant Daniel hadn't just convinced himself. He had convinced his own legal team. And now that belief was unraveling. Daniel shook his head. "No, this doesn't just erase everything else. I've been paying the mortgage, I've maintained the property, and none of that is being ignored," Richard interrupted. But this document introduces a significant complication regarding how the asset is classified. Complication. That word landed heavier than anything else, because Daniel didn't do well with complications. He operated on certainty, control, clear outcomes, and this was neither. "This is insane," Daniel said louder now. "You're letting her twist this into something it's not." I didn't respond. I didn't need to, because for the first time the conversation wasn't about me. It was about him, about what he had assumed, what he had built, what he had overlooked. Richard turned slightly toward him. "Daniel," he said, his tone more direct now. "This isn't about interpretation. This is about documentation." Daniel laughed. A short, sharp sound. "Documentation," he repeated. "You're telling me one piece of paper outweighs everything else." Richard didn't flinch. "I'm telling you that this one piece of paper changes how the entire property is evaluated in this case." The room went quiet again. But this time it wasn't neutral. It was heavy, because there was no longer any ambiguity, no gray area, just a clear shift in reality. Daniel leaned forward, his hands flat on the table now. "So what? I'd just lose the house," he demanded. Richard didn't answer immediately, and that hesitation said more than any response could have, because for the first time, there wasn't an easy answer. Not one Daniel wanted to hear. "We need to reassess your position," Richard said finally. Reassess. Another word Daniel wasn't used to hearing, not in his favor, not in a situation he thought he had already won. "This is unbelievable," Daniel said, shaking his head. "You told me this was solid. It was based on the information I had," Richard replied. There it was, the line, clear, sharp, unavoidable, based on the information I had, which meant something was missing, something had been left out, something Daniel either didn't know or didn't disclose. And either way, it wasn't a small problem. Daniel looked at him, then at the document, then back at me. And for the first time since all of this began, I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Not anger, not arrogance, but uncertainty, real, unfiltered, uncontrolled. "What is this?" he asked me, his voice lower now, not aggressive, not loud, just searching. I met his gaze, calmly. "It's something I put in place a long time ago," I said. For what he asked, for exactly this, I replied. The words hung in the air, simple, direct, impossible to ignore. Daniel stared at me, like he was seeing me differently for the first time. Not as someone passive, not as someone who would step aside, but as someone who had anticipated this moment, long before he ever did. "You planned this?" he asked. There was something almost disbelieving in his voice. I shook my head slightly. "No," I said, "I prepared for it. There's a difference." And in that moment, he finally understood it. Because planning implies intent. Preparation implies awareness. And what I had done years ago wasn't about taking something from him. It was about making sure he couldn't take everything from me. Richard cleared his throat slightly. "We should take a break," he said, not as a suggestion, as a necessity, because the conversation had shifted too far too fast, and no one in the room could continue as if it hadn't. Chairs moved, papers gathered, the structure of the meeting dissolved, but the impact didn't. As Daniel stood, he didn't look at me again right away. He was focused on the document, on Richard, on the reality he was now being forced to confront. And I watched him. Not with satisfaction, not with revenge, but with something else. Recognition, because this was the moment everything he had built his confidence on collapsed. Not because I fought louder, not because I argued harder, but because I had one thing he didn't expect. The truth. Documented, protected, and finally seen. The days after that meeting felt different. Not in a dramatic, explosive way. There were no immediate court orders, no final rulings, no sudden declarations of victory. But something fundamental had shifted, and everyone involved could feel it. Daniel's certainty was gone. Not completely, but enough. Enough that it showed. Enough that it changed how he moved, how he spoke, how he looked at everything that had once seemed so firmly in his control. For me, the shift was quieter, more internal, because while the document had changed the direction of the case, it hadn't changed the reality of what I had just begun to understand. This wasn't just about the house. It never had been. The house was just the most visible piece. the one Daniel had chosen to focus on, the one he believed he could take. But now that the foundation of that claim had cracked, everything else started to come into view. And what I saw was harder to process than anything that had happened in that conference room. Emily called me the next morning. "I've reviewed everything again," she said, her voice calm but more energized than before. "We need to expand our scope." "What do you mean?" I asked. "I mean," she replied, "if his position on the house was built on incomplete or inaccurate information, there's a good chance that's not the only area where things aren't what they seem." I knew what she was implying, but hearing it out loud made it real. "You think there's more?" I asked. "I think we need to find out," she said. And just like that, the focus shifted. No longer just defensive, no longer just about protecting what I had. Now it was about understanding the full picture. We started with the financial records, everything we had access to, everything we could request, everything Daniel had submitted as part of the disclosure process. At first, it looked normal, structured, complete, the kind of documentation you'd expect from someone who believed they had nothing to hide. But as Emily went through it, line by line, detail by detail, patterns began to emerge. Small at first, subtle, easy to overlook, but once you saw them, you couldn't unsee them. Here Emily said during one of our meetings, turning her laptop toward me. A series of transactions, regular, consistent, but unfamiliar. "These weren't part of the shared accounts you mentioned," she said. I leaned closer. "No," I said slowly. "I've never seen those before. The amounts weren't enormous, not at first glance, but they were steady, recurring, and spread across different dates. Could be personal spending," Emily said, "but the pattern is interesting." Interesting. Another careful word, one that didn't accuse but didn't ignore. We kept digging, more records, more statements, and with each layer we uncovered, the picture became clearer. Not all at once, but piece by piece, like something that had been carefully hidden not by being invisible but by being scattered, distributed, blended into the background, until no one thought to question it. Except now, we were. There were accounts I didn't know about, not secret in the sense that they were completely hidden, but separate, disconnected from the financial structure we had always operated under. Accounts that didn't appear in our joint planning, accounts that weren't mentioned in conversations, accounts that existed outside of us. "Daniel was preparing," Emily said quietly. The words landed heavier than anything else we had found. Preparing, not reacting, not adjusting, preparing for what I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Emily didn't hesitate. For a life that didn't include you, the truth of it wasn't shocking, not anymore, but hearing it stated so clearly is still hurt, because it confirmed something I had felt for a long time, but hadn't fully allowed myself to accept. This wasn't just a marriage falling apart. This was a transition, one he had been planning, one he had been building toward, and the house. The house was part of that plan, not just as a place to live, but as a foundation, a symbol, a resource, something he could carry into that next life. Without me. We found more. Expenses that didn't align with anything in our shared life. Payments to places I had never been. Charges that suggested something else. Someone else. Emily didn't jump to conclusions. She didn't need to. The evidence spoke quietly but clearly. "Do you recognize any of these?" she asked. I shook my head. No, and I meant it. Because whatever Daniel had been building, he hadn't included me in any part of it. Not the planning, not the spending, not the intention, which meant one thing. He hadn't just been distancing himself emotionally. He had already left, in every way that mattered except physically. And now, he was trying to finalize that exit on his terms, with his version of the story intact. But that version was starting to fall apart, because the more we uncovered, the harder it became for him to maintain it. His disclosures were incomplete, not dramatically, not in a way that screamed deception, but enough. Enough to raise questions, enough to shift credibility, enough to matter, and in a case like this, credibility was everything. "He's going to have to explain this," Emily said. I nodded slowly, but my thoughts weren't on the legal implications, not entirely. They were on something else, something more personal, because as I sat there looking at the numbers, the accounts, the patterns, I realized something that cut deeper than anything else. Daniel hadn't just been planning to leave, he had been planning to replace the life, the image, the environment, everything. And the house was supposed to be part of that, the backdrop for a version of himself that didn't include me, a cleaner version, a more impressive one where he didn't have to share credit or history or truth, just results. And for a moment, that realization hit me harder than anything else had, not because I still wanted that life, but because of how easily he had been willing to erase me from it, after everything, after years, after building something together, or at least what I thought was together. But then, something else settled in, something quieter, stronger, clarity, because the more I saw, the more I understood something simple. This was never about me not being enough. It was about him needing something else, something bigger, something more visible, something that validated him in a way our life no longer did. And instead of building that honestly, he tried to take it from me, using what we had created together as a shortcut. But now, that shortcut was gone. The house was no longer his to claim. The narrative was no longer his to control. And the truth, the full truth, was starting to come into view. Not just for me, not just for Emily, but for everyone involved. And once that truth was fully seen, there would be no going back. Because this wasn't just about dividing assets anymore. This was about revealing intent. And intent changes everything. The confrontation didn't happen in a courtroom. It didn't happen in front of lawyers or under fluorescent lights or with documents spread across a table. It happened in the house. Of course it did, because that was where everything had started and where everything needed to end. It was late afternoon when Daniel came back. The light coming through the windows had that soft golden tone, the kind that used to make the house feel warm, lived in, peaceful. Now it just felt still, like the walls were waiting. I was in the living room when I heard the door open. His footsteps were slower than usual, measured, not hesitant but not confident either. When he stepped into the room and saw me, he paused, just for a second, like he hadn't expected me to be there. Or maybe he hadn't expected me to be the same. "Hey," he said, casual, too casual, as if we weren't in the middle of dismantling everything we had built. "Hi," I replied. My voice was calm, steady, and I could see it immediately. That unsettled him more than anything else could have. He set his keys down, looked around briefly, then back at me. "We need to talk," he said. I nodded, I know. For a moment, neither of us moved. The space between us felt different now. Not tense, not fragile, just clear. Like all the things we had avoided saying for years were finally standing in the open. Daniel walked a few steps closer. Not too close, just enough. "I spoke to Richard," he said. "I waited. He thinks this document changes things." He continued, the word document coming out with a slight edge. "It does," I said simply. He exhaled through his nose like he was trying to keep something in check. "You didn't tell me about it," he said. There it was. Not curiosity, not confusion, but accusation. "I didn't need to," I replied. His jaw tightened. "That's not how marriage works, Sarah." I almost smiled. Not because it was funny, but because of how familiar that line felt. "That's not how marriage works," I repeated quietly. He didn't respond. Not right away, because I think part of him realized what I was about to say before I said it. "You used my inheritance without telling me," I continued. His eyes flickered. "You made financial decisions behind my back." He shifted slightly. "You built a plan to leave without ever being honest about it." The words landed one after the other. Not loud, not aggressive, but precise. And for the first time, he didn't interrupt. Because there was nothing to interrupt. No exaggeration. No distortion. Just truth. "That was different," he said finally. I looked at him. How he opened his mouth, then paused. Because there wasn't an easy answer. Because there wasn't a version of that explanation that didn't expose exactly what he had done. "You're twisting things," he said instead. There it was. Deflection. The same pattern. But it didn't have the same effect anymore. "I'm not twisting anything," I said. "I'm just not ignoring it anymore." The room went quiet again, but this time, it wasn't heavy. It wasn't tense. It was final. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, pacing slightly now. "This doesn't change everything," he said. "We can still figure this out. Figure this out. The words sounded strange coming from him now, because just weeks ago, he'd already decided everything, the house, the outcome, my place in it, or lack of one. What exactly are we figuring out, I asked. He stopped pacing, looked at me. This, he said, gesturing vaguely around the room. Us, the house, the settlement. I held his gaze. There is no house, Daniel. He flinched, just slightly, but I saw it. And the house, he asked. The question came out differently, quieter, less certain. Not a claim anymore, a question. I took a breath, and for a moment, I let myself feel it. Everything tied to this place, the years, the effort, the silence. The compromises, the version of myself that had stood in this exact room, choosing not to speak, choosing not to correct, choosing to believe that what we had was enough. Then I looked at him. The house isn't something you get to take, I said. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It's something I helped build. Something I protected. Something you tried to rewrite. He shook his head. I didn't try to rewrite anything. Yes, you did, I said, and this time, there was no softness in my voice, no hesitation. You told people it was yours. You told yourself it was yours, and then you tried to make it legally yours. The words sat between us, unavoidable, unarguable. Daniel looked away for a moment toward the kitchen, the same kitchen where so many of our arguments had happened, where he had first said those words. This is my house. You never corrected me, he said quietly. There it was, the justification, the attempt to shift responsibility. I nodded slightly. You're right, I said. That seemed to surprise him. I didn't, I continued, because I thought we were a team, because I thought it didn't matter who got the credit, because I believed that what we had was real, even if the story we told wasn't perfect. I took a step closer, not aggressive, just present. But you didn't see it that way. He looked back at me, and this time, there was no confidence, no control, just something else, something more honest. You let it become something else, I said. You let it become a story where I didn't matter. He didn't respond, because there was nothing left to say, because everything that needed to be said had already been. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't tense. It was complete. Like a conversation that had been waiting years to happen had finally reached its end. Daniel exhaled slowly, then nodded once, almost to himself. Okay, he said, not agreement, not acceptance, just acknowledgement that something had changed, that something couldn't be undone, that whatever version of this situation he had been holding on to was no longer real. He picked up his keys again, but this time he didn't rush, didn't slam the door, didn't say anything else. He just walked out. And when the door closed behind him, the house felt different, not empty, not quiet, but lighter, like something that had been pressing against the walls for years had finally been released. I stood there for a moment, alone, but not the kind of alone I had felt before. This wasn't isolation. This was space, clarity, ownership, not just of the house, but of myself. Because the truth was, the document hadn't just protected my home. It had forced me to face something I had avoided for years. That staying silent doesn't keep peace. It just delays the moment when the truth finally demands to be heard. And now that it had, there was no going back, only forward. And for the first time in a long time, that didn't scare me. The legal resolution didn't come with a dramatic courtroom moment, no judge striking a gavel, no final speech that wrapped everything into a clean cinematic ending. Instead, it unfolded the way most real outcomes do through negotiations, revisions, quiet agreements, and the slow unraveling of a position that could no longer hold. But make no mistake, Daniel lost the house, and he knew it before anyone had to say it out loud. After our confrontation, everything shifted in the legal process, not abruptly, but decisively. Richard Coleman's tone changed in every communication that followed. Emails became more cautious. Language became more precise. There were no more assumptions, no more confident assertions about Daniel retaining the property. Instead, there were phrases like, in light of the newly presented documentation, given the complexity surrounding the original source of funds, reconsideration of asset classification. Careful, measured, strategic. But beneath all of it, clear. Daniel's claim to the house was no longer viable. Emily saw it immediately. "They're repositioning," she told me during one of our calls. I can tell I replied. "They know they can't win that argument anymore," she continued. "Now they're trying to limit the damage, limit the damage." The phrase stuck with me, because for Daniel, this wasn't just about losing an asset. It was about losing the narrative. The version of himself he had been presenting to me, to others, maybe even to himself, was starting to fracture. And once that happens, it's hard to hold anything together. The negotiations that followed were different from what I had expected. Not hostile, not aggressive, but grounded. For the first time since this began, the conversation felt real, stripped of performance, stripped of assumptions, just facts, numbers, documents, truth. The house was no longer up for debate, not in the way it had been before. Instead, the focus shifted to everything around it: division of remaining assets, financial adjustments, accountability for discrepancies. And those discrepancies, they mattered more than I initially realized, because as Emily continued reviewing Daniel's financial disclosures, the inconsistencies we had found earlier became part of the discussion. Not accusations, not dramatic revelations, but questions, clear, direct, unavoidable. These transactions need to be explained. These accounts need to be disclosed fully. These omissions affect the overall settlement. Each point added weight, not explosive on its own, but together, significant. And Daniel couldn't dismiss them the way he had dismissed everything else before, because now the foundation of his credibility had already been shaken. And once that happens, everything else becomes harder to defend. I never saw the exact moment he accepted it. There was no call, no message, no admission, but I felt it. In the shift of tone, in the absence of resistance, in the way the negotiations moved forward without the same level of pushback. He wasn't fighting anymore. Not for the house, not for control, just managing the outcome, minimizing what he could, holding on to what was left, and that, in its own way, said everything. The final agreement came together over several weeks, carefully, methodically, reviewed, revised, finalized. When Emily sent me the completed version, I didn't open it right away. I sat with it for a moment, just like I had with the divorce papers. But this time, the feeling was different. Not heavy, not uncertain, just calm. When I finally read it, everything was clear. The house remained with me, fully, not partially, not conditionally. Mine, legally, officially, undeniably. Other assets were divided accordingly. Adjustments made, discrepancies accounted for. Nothing excessive, nothing dramatic, just fair. Balanced, final. When it came time to sign, I didn't hesitate. Not because it was easy, but because it was right. Because for the first time in a long time, everything on paper matched what I had always known to be true. I wasn't taking something from Daniel. I wasn't winning something that didn't belong to me. I was keeping what I had helped build, what I had protected, what I had nearly lost. By staying silent too long, Daniel signed separately. We didn't do it in the same room. There was no need, no final meeting, no closing conversation, just two signatures on the same reality. After it was done, Emily called me. "It's finalized," she said. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Thank you," I said. "You handled this well," she replied. "Not just legally, but strategically." I thought about that for a moment. Strategically, maybe. But it hadn't felt like strategy at the time. It had felt like survival. Like finally stepping into something I had avoided for years. I just stopped ignoring things, I said quietly. Emily paused, then said something I didn't expect. "That's harder than most people think." After the call ended, I sat alone in the living room, the same room where everything had shifted. The same room where Daniel had stood so certain, so confident, so convinced that the house would be his. And now, he was gone. Not just physically, but completely. There were no traces of him left in the way the house felt. No tension. No unspoken pressure. No invisible weight. Just space. Quiet. Stillness. But not the kind that feels empty. The kind that feels open. I walked through the house slowly, room by room. Not inspecting, not evaluating, just noticing. The kitchen, the hallway, the bedroom, each space felt different. Not because anything had physically changed, but because something internal had. For years, I had moved through these rooms carefully, adjusting, accommodating, silencing parts of myself to keep everything stable, and now there was nothing left to adjust to. Nothing left to accommodate. No one left to make myself smaller for. I stopped in the doorway for a moment, looking out at the backyard. The light was softer now, the day fading into evening, and for the first time, the house didn't feel like something I had to hold on to. It felt like something that held me, steady, secure, mine. Not because a document said so, but because I finally understood it, understood what it meant, understood what it had cost, understood what it took to keep it. And as I stood there, I realized something simple. Winning didn't feel the way I thought it would. It wasn't loud, it wasn't emotional, it wasn't even particularly satisfying. It was quiet, grounded, certain, the kind of feeling that doesn't need to prove anything, because it already knows. And for the first time in a long time, so did I. The first morning I woke up in the house after everything was finalized, I didn't recognize the feeling right away. It wasn't relief. Not exactly. It wasn't happiness either. Not the kind people imagine when something difficult finally ends. It was quieter than that. Softer. I opened my eyes and just lay there, listening. Not for anything specific, just noticing the absence of something I hadn't realized had been there for so long. Tension, that constant low-level awareness that had followed me from room to room, day to day, decision to decision. It was gone, and in its place, there was space. I sat up slowly, letting the morning light filter through the curtains, the same light that had been there every day before, but now it felt different. Lighter, less filtered, more mine. For a long time, I just stayed there, taking it in, because this wasn't just the end of something. It was the beginning of something I hadn't allowed myself to imagine clearly before. A life without Daniel, not defined by him, not adjusted around him, not shaped by what he needed, expected, or controlled, just mine. The first thing I did that day was simple. I made coffee in the same kitchen, using the same mug, standing in the same spot I had stood in for years. But everything felt different. Not because the space had changed, but because I had. I didn't rush. I didn't check the time. I didn't think about what needed to be done for someone else. I just moved, at my own pace. And for the first time in a long time, that felt unfamiliar. Not uncomfortable, just new. Over the next few days, I started noticing things. Small things, details I had overlooked, or maybe ignored. The way the living room had always been arranged to Daniel's preference. The colors he had insisted on. The furniture placement he had chosen. The subtle ways the house had reflected him. More than us. I hadn't questioned it before, because it seemed easier not to. Because compromise had felt like peace. But now, I had the opportunity to see it differently. And slowly I started making changes. Not drastic ones. Not all at once. Just adjustments. I moved a chair, rearranged the bookshelves, changed the placement of a table. Things that on the surface didn't seem significant, but each one carried a quiet meaning. This is mine now. Not in a possessive way, not in a defensive way, just a truthful one. I wasn't reclaiming the house. I was finally inhabiting it. There's a difference. Friends reached out, some cautiously, some directly. Are you okay? Do you need anything? Do you want company? I appreciated it. I really did. But more often than not, I found myself saying something I hadn't expected. I'm okay, I told them. And I meant it, not perfectly. Not without moments of reflection. Not without memories that surfaced unexpectedly. But okay, stable, grounded. Because the truth was, the hardest part wasn't being alone. It was being unseen. And now, that wasn't the case anymore. One afternoon, I found myself standing in the hallway looking at a section of wall that had always felt incomplete. For years, I had thought about putting something there. Photos, art, something personal. But I had never followed through, because Daniel hadn't thought it was necessary. Leave it clean, he had said once. It looks better that way. So I did. I left it. Empty, neutral, unclaimed. But that afternoon, I didn't ask anyone. I didn't hesitate. I just chose. I brought out a set of framed photos I had kept stored away, pictures of my mother, moments from earlier years, pieces of my life that had nothing to do with Daniel. And I hung them, carefully, one by one, stepping back occasionally to adjust, to see, to feel. And when I was done, I stood there for a long time, looking at them. Not because they were perfect, but because they were mine. Not filtered, not approved, not negotiated, just real. That moment stayed with me because it wasn't about the photos, it was about something else, something deeper, the realization that for years I had been editing myself, softening, adjusting, minimizing, to fit into a version of life that required me to be less visible, less present, less me. And I hadn't even realized how much of myself I had set aside until I started bringing it back, piece by piece. The house began to feel different, not just physically, but emotionally. It no longer held the same weight, the same tension, the same quiet undercurrent of compromise. Instead, it felt open, not empty, but open, like it had space for something new, something honest, something that didn't require me to explain or justify my presence. One evening, I sat outside on the patio, the same place where we used to have dinners, where conversations once flowed easily before they didn't. The air was calm, the sky fading into soft colors as the sun set, and for a moment, I let myself feel everything. Not just the relief, but the loss. Because even though I had gained clarity, I had also lost something. Not the version of the marriage that had existed at the end, but the version I had once believed in, the one I had worked for, the one I had protected, the one I had stayed for. And that mattered. It deserved to be acknowledged, to be felt, to be released. I didn't rush past it. I didn't push it away. I just sat with it until it settled, until it became something I could carry, without it weighing me down. Because that's the thing about healing. It's not about forgetting, it's about understanding. And once you understand, you don't need to hold on the same way anymore. Later that night, as I walked back inside, I paused at the doorway, looking into the house, at the lights, the rooms, the space. And I realized something I hadn't fully put into words yet. For years, I had thought this house was something I needed to protect, from loss, from change, from being taken. But now, I saw it differently. The house wasn't what needed protecting. I was. And once I did that, everything else fell into place. Because in the end, this wasn't just about keeping a home. It was about finally coming home to myself. I still remember the exact way Daniel said it. My house. Not loud, not angry, just certain. Like it had already been decided somewhere beyond the room we were standing in. Like I was already gone. Like everything I had built, contributed, protected, had somehow disappeared from the story. At the time, I didn't argue. I didn't correct him. I didn't fight back. And for a long time after that, I wondered why. Why I stayed quiet. Why I let that version of the truth exist. Why I allowed him to believe something so far from reality. But now, standing in the same house, in the same space, with everything finally settled, I understand. I wasn't weak. I wasn't unaware. I was trying to hold something together, trying to preserve a version of our life that I thought was still worth saving. Even when the signs were already there, even when the truth was already starting to surface. And maybe that's the hardest part of all of this. Not what he did, not what he said, but how long I stayed silent in response. Because silence feels like peace. At first, it feels like patience, like understanding, like strength. But over time, if it's not met with honesty, it becomes something else. It becomes permission. Permission for someone else to define the story, to take credit, to shift reality, to slowly erase you without ever saying it directly. And that's what happened. Not all at once, not in a single moment, but gradually, over years, until one day the person standing across from me didn't just believe the story he had created. He acted on it. He built a plan around it. He tried to take something that was never his to claim alone. And for the first time, I didn't stay silent. Not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly. Because clarity doesn't need volume. It just needs truth. The document I placed on that table, it mattered, legally, strategically, practically. It changed the outcome. It protected the house. It shifted the entire direction of the case. But if I'm honest, it wasn't the most important thing. Not really. The most important thing was the moment I decided to stop shrinking, to stop adjusting, to stop allowing someone else's version of reality to overwrite my own, because that's the part no one sees. The quiet decision, the internal shift, The moment you realize that what you've been tolerating is no longer acceptable, that what you've been protecting is no longer protecting you, that what you've been calling keeping the peace is actually costing you something. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to pretending. You can't keep playing a role in a story that no longer includes you. Daniel thought the house was his because I never corrected him, because I never challenged him, because I let him believe the version of events that made him feel in control. But belief isn't ownership, and confidence isn't truth. And when the moment came, when everything had to be laid out clearly, what mattered wasn't what he believed. It was what was real, what was documented, what was built on something solid. And for the first time, that reality spoke for me. I didn't need to argue. I didn't need to prove myself emotionally. I didn't need to convince anyone, because the truth was already there, waiting, quiet, patient, unmoved by his certainty. And when it finally surfaced, it didn't just change the outcome. It revealed everything. Not just about the house, but about him, about me, about what our marriage had become, and about what it never really was. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that protection doesn't always look the way you expect. Sometimes it's not loud, not visible, not even used for years. Sometimes it's a decision you make quietly, a boundary you set without announcing it, a safeguard you hope you'll never need. But that's there, just in case. And sometimes that quiet protection becomes the one thing that changes everything, not because it creates conflict, but because it reveals truth. And truth, once it's seen, doesn't need to fight. It just stands. I still live in this house, but it doesn't feel the same. Not because of what happened here, but because of what I understand now. It's not a symbol of a marriage anymore. It's not something tied to someone else's narrative. It's not a place I have to defend. It's just mine. Not in a way that excludes others, but in a way that includes me. Fully, completely, without compromise, without erasure, without silence. And every time I walk through the front door, I don't think about what almost happened. I don't think about what I could have lost. I think about what I finally chose, to stand, to speak, to stop disappearing. Because in the end, the house was never the real victory. The real victory was remembering that I was never something that could be taken. The hardest truth I had to face wasn't that my marriage ended. It was that, for a long time, I had been disappearing inside it. Not in obvious ways, not in ways anyone else could easily see, but in small, quiet decisions, choosing not to speak up, choosing to avoid conflict, choosing to protect someone else's comfort at the cost of my own clarity. And over time, those choices add up. They shape how people see you. But more importantly, they shape how you see yourself. If there's anything I hope you take from my story, it's this. Silence is not always strength. Sometimes it's a delay, a pause before something inevitable. And the longer you stay silent, the easier it becomes for someone else to define your reality, your value, your place. Protecting yourself doesn't mean you expect the worst from people. It means you respect yourself enough to be prepared if things change, emotionally, legally, personally, because life doesn't always unfold the way we hope it will. People don't always stay who we believe they are, and love, no matter how real it once felt, doesn't guarantee fairness. But truth has a way of surfacing, even if it takes years, even if it waits quietly in the background. And when it does, it doesn't need to be loud, it doesn't need to be dramatic, it just needs to be seen. So I want to ask you something. If you were in my place, would you have revealed the document earlier, or would you have waited like I did? Tell me in the comments. I really want to hear your thoughts. And wherever you're watching from, let me know your location and what time it is there right now. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt underestimated, overlooked, or quietly pushed aside, make sure you subscribe. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones where someone finally decides to stop disappearing.